Today, we're wading into one of the biggest, most debated questions in all of history. Was Jesus of Nazareth a real person? We're going to break down the actual historical case for his existence, looking at the evidence and the arguments that scholars, not theologians but historians, use to try and answer that very question. So let's just frame this up right from the start. Is Jesus of Nazareth purely a figure of faith, someone who exists in the realm of belief, or is he a figure who can be studied as a fact of history? For this explainer, we're putting on our historian hats. We are strictly looking through that historical lens.
And that really brings us to square one, doesn't it? Before we can talk about miracles or teachings or anything else, we have to tackle the most fundamental question. Did a guy named Jesus of Nazareth even walk the earth?
Well, right away, you see this massive gap between what you might see online and what's happening in the academic world. The popular internet view you see a lot is that Jesus was basically a myth, a story made up by the church. But when you turn to actual historical scholarship, the consensus is pretty overwhelming. A man named Jesus of Nazareth really did exist.
And this quote, wow, it just nails the point. And look who it's from. This isn't some Christian apologist. This is Bart Ehrman, one of the leading agnostic scholars of the New Testament and a huge critic of traditional Christianity. And even he says the idea that Jesus never existed is, well, ridiculous. So that's the key takeaway here. Historians, whether they're believers or total skeptics, they all agree on this one basic fact, even if they're about to argue about everything that comes next.
So why are they so confident? Well, because we're not just looking at the Bible. We have other sources. We have the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about Christ and his execution. We have the Jewish historian Josephus, who also mentions Jesus. These outside, non-Christian sources are a huge reason why his existence is pretty much taken as a given in historical circles. Okay, so if historians agree he existed, what's next? Well, now we get to the central claim of Christianity, what our source material calls the game over question, the resurrection. Because if that happened, the whole conversation just changes completely. So what's the historical evidence that's actually put forward for this event? First things first, we have to talk about how historians handle the Gospels. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't those faith documents? And yes, they absolutely are. But they are also the earliest and most detailed sources we have for the life of Jesus. For any figure in ancient history, you have to start with the primary eyewitness accounts. Historians don't just accept them blindly, of course. They use critical analysis, but they definitely don't just throw them out. So our source gives us this handy little memory tool, FACTS, to lay out the case. F is for fatal wounds. Historians, believers, and not agree that crucifixion was lethal. He really died. A is for appeared to others. His followers claimed he appeared to them after his death. Now, even skeptical scholars will grant that they had powerful experiences that they believed were the risen Christ. C is for committed disciples. These guys went from hiding in a locked room to being willing to suffer and die for this belief. And S is for strong testimony. Their story started a movement that is still going 2,000 years later, and that historical fact by itself needs some kind of explanation. And here's where it gets really compelling. It's not just that they believed, it's who believed. We're not just talking about a group of friends who were already on board. You've got James, Jesus' own brother, who was a skeptic while Jesus was alive. And he becomes a leader in the church. And then you have the most dramatic one of all, Saul of Tarsus. This guy was violently persecuting Christians, and then he does a complete 180 and becomes the Apostle Paul. For a historian, the conversion of an enemy is a very powerful piece of data. And think about this for a second. After Jesus was publicly executed, where did the disciples go to start preaching this message of his resurrection? Did they go to some faraway town where no one knew them? No. They went right back to Jerusalem, the scene of the crime. The one place on earth where hundreds of people could have stood up and said, no, that's not what happened. We saw the body. Okay, I know what you're probably thinking. There have got to be some major holes in all of this, right? Of course. So let's turn to some of the biggest objections and doubts people have and see how the source material addresses them. Here's a huge one you hear all the time. How can we possibly trust witnesses from 2,000 years ago? You know, the argument that they were just primitive, superstitious people who would believe anything, that their testimony is just not reliable. The response to that comes from this brilliant idea by the writer C.S. Lewis. He called it chronological snobbery. It's this subtle, unthinking assumption that just because we live now with all our technology, we're somehow smarter or more rational than people in the past. But ancient people weren't idiots. They knew the difference between a myth and something that happened yesterday, and they for sure knew that dead people stay dead.
Here's another common objection. Eyewitness testimony isn't even that reliable in a modern courtroom, and that's a fair point. But, and this is a huge but, you can't apply that same standard to ancient history. Today, we have DNA, we have video footage. For ancient historians, eyewitness accounts were often the only evidence they have to work with. The entire field is built on analyzing these kinds of sources.
But what about the fact that the Gospels themselves say some of the disciples had doubts, even when they supposedly saw the risen Jesus? Well, the argument here is that this detail actually makes the story more believable, not less. Their doubt shows they weren't just a bunch of gullible fools ready to believe anything. No, their first reaction was disbelief, because they had a firm grip on reality. They knew dead people don't just come back to life.
All right, let's tackle the final objection. And this one might be the biggest one for people living in the 21st century, in a world filled with thousands of different beliefs. You've probably heard this question, maybe even thought it yourself. It's famously put by Ricky Gervais. Throughout history, humans have worshipped thousands of gods. What makes you think your one is the right one? It's a really powerful and common challenge.
The core of the response is actually a philosophical point. And it's pretty simple when you break it down. Just because there are a lot of competing claims doesn't automatically mean that one of them can't be true. Think about it. 1,000 wrong answers on a test doesn't mean there isn't one right answer. It just means you have to look at the evidence for each claim on its own merits.
This source gives this great courtroom analogy to really drive the point home. Imagine a crime happens in a city like Toronto. The defendant gets up and says, "There are 3 million people in this city. Out of all of them, you really think it was me?" A judge would just laugh at that, right? They wouldn't care about the 2,999,999 other people. They'd look at one thing. What does the evidence say about this specific person? And this all leads to this final, really powerful image. The argument is that lots of belief systems might look the same from a distance. They're like big, beautiful mansions. But some of them, when you get up close and knock on the walls, you realize they're made of styrofoam. There's no solid foundation. The claim being made here is that Christianity is different, that it's a beautiful mansion built on a solid foundation of real, verifiable historical events that you can actually investigate. So after all that, after looking at the consensus that he existed, the specific case for the resurrection, and the answers to some really tough objections, we're left with this. This is the fundamental question that sits at the very heart of this entire topic, and it forces us all to think about that line, the line where historical evidence ends and where a step of faith might just begin.